All right, welcome everybody to the Sentinels of Liberty podcast. I am your host, Redbeard, and I greatly appreciate each and every one of you for stopping by the show tonight. It should be a pretty decent show. It shouldn't be something that's going to be super long, but hopefully it'll be informative. You guys and gals will be able to get a little something out of it, and I will do my very best to be as cohesive and tight in my explanations of things as possible. As you all know, we put liberty first here, and we're uncompromising in our principles, or I should say I am, because I am the only guy who works at my studio, if you can call it that. So that is the goal, that is the aim, that is the mission parameters here. And as you can see in in the description, I should say, above, or the title rather, it's Cato's Warnings, a Compromised Constitution. Now, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Cato, Cato was one of the, let's see here. I'm not muted, so it may be on your end. Let me know if you guys can hear me real quick. Let's do a quick sound check. Give me some verification. Okay, perfect. Roger that. So for those of you who don't know who Cato is, he is an anti-federalist, and he was one of the dissenting opinions, or voices rather, as it pertained to the case against ratification. And there's a number of them. We're going to focus on this particular episode really in one area. I don't want to spread out too much because I think if we can take some time to focus in on a variety of different areas per episode, I think it's going to make a little bit more sense. But Cato was one of the biggest voices, I would argue, as it pertained to the anti-federalist movement, along with Luther Martin, George Mason, and the Pennsylvania dissenters, as it were, along with Elbridge Gerry, who was also involved in that, and some others. But it should be hopefully able to paint a pretty decent picture as to where the thoughts were, at least for Cato, as it pertained more specifically to the Senate and some of the issues that he thought, I really just can't get behind this. I don't think the Senate is necessarily restrained. And moreover, one of the issues that he had with the Senate, and you could even say in part Congress, as it were, was the fact that Senate just had too much power. It did not properly allow the people's voices and representation to really get into the works of things, and the lines became pretty blurry. So before we get super into this, I do want to give a big shout out here real quick to Michael Bolden and Mike Meharry from the 10th Amendment Center. The 10th Amendment Center obviously put out the book from which I'm going to use some of the references from here today. If you haven't picked up this book yet, it is a fantastic book. It is The Anti-Federalists Were Right. A lot of great notations here and big props, and big thanks for these guys for putting this stuff out, compiling this material. They really do a pretty good job over there. And if you feel so inclined, go and maybe toss a little bit of scratch their way. They take donations to help kind of keep everything going. So I can't recommend the 10th Amendment Center enough. So one of the things, there's a number of things that Cato really was worried about. And as we go through some of this stuff, you'll start to see kind of his concerns fleshed out a little bit more. But I want to go over briefly some of the main points that you'll probably see as we go through here. So the first one was entrenched elites. 6-year terms with no direct accountability to the people would guarantee the rise of a permanent political class. Then you have cronyism. Control over appointments would become a tool to build a network of influence, ensuring only political allies held power. Unchecked foreign policy. This is something that we talked about previously, I believe. Power over treaties would allow them to entangle the nation in foreign wars and debt. So they were very, very concerned about the power that Senate had in this area in particular, and more so the influence that the treaties would open as it pertained to foreign governments. You also have sham accountability. The power to try all impeachments meant that they would sit as judge and jury for their own political allies. Boy, where have we seen that one before? He may have been over the mark on this. I'm willing to say I think he was. And then collapse checks and balances. A close connection to the executive would destroy any meaningful separation of powers, creating a ruling partnership instead of competing branches. Now, those were some of the primary concerns as it pertained to the Senate, right? And I think if we look at contemporary times today and we look at where things are today, I think we're starting to see that. I mean, we just had, to that last point, and we look at like the pardoning ability that exists. We're really starting to see a lot more of that come into fruition with different administrations, to where it's like, oh, I have to pardon the people closest to me to make sure that they don't get in trouble, to make sure they can't be held liable for anything, to make sure that they get off scot-free. And it really turns into that crony, good old boy system where the people that very likely should have been indicted or at least brought up on some form of charges for some type of illegal or illicit activity, they're just going to be able to walk free. And this is a system that Cato very, very much was concerned about. It was something that he genuinely had a concern about. But before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at what he really thought of the Senate. Now, in the first opening salvo that Cato has and is described here, Cato essentially looked at the Senate as like an aristocracy that is invariably going to rise with very little restrictions whatsoever, and the overwhelming amount of jurisdiction and authority and power that the Senate would be given via the Constitution. He was very worried that we were going to see an aristocratic system. And even going so far as to say the Senate would be so far removed from the people as to have little or no connection with them essentially at all. So the whole point that Cato was trying to make here was the fact that he feared that there would be a system that would have no accountability, no oversight. It would be so far removed from the people, there's no connection, and therefore you would give yourself away to being able to do whatever essentially it is that you want. He kind of feared that you would have, again, this crony or this good old boy system that would come from a myriad of other issues. And as we go farther, you'll start to see this. And so I want to emphasize here, there's a reason also prior to that particular quote in the book that there's an emphasis that he was worried about the fact that the House of Representatives, which are the representatives of the people, were underrepresented in the government. He felt that there was not enough representatives within the government, and he felt that the ability for the Senate to be able to do as they will with a proper representation to the people was just too large, too wide, too encroaching. And so this presented a particular issue. And I want to go and say, when we look at the House of Representatives, they are directly elected by the people. Okay. Cato warned, and this is a portion from the book here, Cato warned that the Senate's indirect election by state legislatures would sever its connection from public accountability, which would essentially create a permanent political elite, something that was really emphasized, obviously, by Michael Bolden and Mike Meharry, but this was something that Cato realistically felt. And so when you start to pull these individuals away from the people and they lack a sufficient amount of representation, you're creating this political elite, this political class that is so far departed that really it's almost unrecognizable. And there's a lot of inherent issues with that, right? You start to gather these systems to where they can assume a little bit more power over time. They don't feel nearly as beholden to the authority as delegated by the people. They don't feel restrained by the people whatsoever. And probably they get this air of confidence. I would imagine where Cato's coming from. They get this air of confidence to where they no longer have to listen necessarily to the people. And so furthermore, to add to this, right? As Michael Bolden and Mike Maharrey go on to write, furthermore, unlike the House, where frequent elections offered some degree of accountability, the Senate's 6-year terms gave it, as Cato says, the resemblance to perpetuity. Okay, so there was this idea that there would just be a perpetuation of the Senate. There was no real, it didn't seem like the Senate had a reasonable amount of rotation as it pertained to bringing new people in potentially, or being cycled through enough, not having enough to where it would kind of disrupt the flow of power or disrupt the consolidation of power. Cato was really worried about that, whereas the House of Representatives, they kind of had that, and so there's where you kind of get that argument that Cato has had, which is we need to really bolster up the House of Representatives, and we need to be very mindful and maybe even withdraw a little bit from what the Senate has. Now, his primary concern here was that the senators eventually would entrench themselves and make it very hard to kind of dislodge them from this power, creating a long-running tract of continuous perpetual power, right? As he says, the resemblance to perpetuity. He was very worried about that. So if you take this together, as they go on to say in the book, the combination of long terms and indirect elections made it likely that senators would cease representing their state's interest and instead focus on preserving their own power and privilege. Again, this idea that it's no longer about the people who put them there, but it's more about whatever it is that they feel is going to best serve them and serve their ambitions. This was something that he was extremely, extremely worried about. Now, going forward, now you have this painted picture where Cato is very worried about this political elite, this political class of superior individuals, essentially. He takes this and he goes on to talk about appointments. He was very worried about appointments. And so, essentially, he was worried about the fact that the Senate would be very, very connected with the executive through the ability to go forth and pursue appointments, right? Through its role in appointments, but in the book here, leading to corruption and an oligarchic system, something that he was very, very concerned about. He goes on to say, when none but men of opulence will hold the seat, what is there left to resist and repel this host of influence and power? So he was very worried that now we went from an argument of political elite to the idea that they would be able to just simply put in the people that would agree with them, that would go with their system, that would ultimately better serve them and be able to help foster and perpetuate whatever system or agenda it is that they have. And this was something that they were very, very concerned about. And having that bleed into the executive, having something to where you have a very close relationship with the executive, to where if you are very friendly with the executive, you are willing to do certain things and put certain people into positions of power that ultimately would not really serve the people or their respective states, but rather serve the executive and the Senate, as it were. Now, furthermore, the issues don't just simply stop there. He was very, very concerned over treaties. Now, Michael Maharrey and Michael Bolden go on to say, for Cato, the Constitution's treaty power was not just a flaw, it was a fundamental betrayal of Republican government. In his view, the Constitution created a dangerous shortcut, allowing the president and Senate to bypass the people's direct representatives in the House. He argued that any law as powerful and permanent as a treaty, and I'm going to quote Cato here, ought to be the united act of all the branches of government. Furthermore, essentially, that meant one of the government's most important duties could be managed by the Senate, okay, and executive alone, without the aid or interference of the House of Representatives, unquote. So you had two quotes there where Cato was explaining essentially what the dangers were. And again, you're starting to see this concern that he had, where you have the Senate and the executive essentially bleeding together, having this microcosm or this vacuum of power that they would immediately consume in order to have essentially a fairly biased amalgamation of both treaties, and one could even say appointments. Now, the issue is if you have a political elite that's there that aligns with the executive, and there's really no definitive line there, there's no real restraint there, then they would be able to come in and then they would be able to affect those appointments. And when you get the proper appointments that fall in line with exactly what the executive wants and that falls in line with what the Senate would like, then you start getting into the realm of treaties. And this is where it becomes very, very dangerous. Now, moving forward, he goes on to say, and he quotes, a power that may be exercised in various ways so as to affect your person and property, and even the domain of a nation. So he's talking about the structural defect that gave a small group of elites nearly unlimited power to trade away American lives, land, and treasure. The consequences were terrifyingly broad. This is what Michael Bolden and Michael Meharry had essentially said in their book, explaining the fears that Cato had. He was very, very worried about the fact that with this consolidation of power, with having all of the people in the right places that were overwhelmingly approving to the system that was being set up, you're really able just to sell everything out from the American people. They would have no real say in it. They'd have no real direct representation because, again, you're cutting out the House of Representatives, and essentially you're just throwing under the bus the states of the Union. So you're seeing this situation that's set up that is not good for the state sovereignty, but it's even worse for the people that live within the several states. There was an ultimate fear here. It wasn't always entirely about property. It was about blood. He saw the treaty power, and I'm quoting this from Michael Holden, or from the book here, as the mechanism that would transform a self-governing republic into an empire, forced to fight in conflicts that had nothing to do with its own security. And what Cato has to say about this, what he emphasized about this, per him, engagements may be made to raise an army, and you may be transported to Europe to fight wars of ambitious proxies. Boy, it sounds kind of stark like we're seeing this, okay? It seems like we're seeing this type of situation in modern day, as it were, okay? You have an executive that has the favor of the Senate. You have a very favorable Senate that made very favorable appointments to the executive, and then furthermore, the treaties and the dealings with various countries that create an unhealthy alliance, and then that unhealthy alliance, or an entangling alliance, as the founders had seen it, would all of a sudden give way to going and fighting on behalf of these people that have nothing to do with the security and the structure and the defense of our country, but rather on behalf of proxies and other people with things that have no interest or no concern for the United States. This was something that he felt very, very strongly about. And he goes on to say, money may be contracted for, and you must pay it. You must pay it, is what he says. So he was very concerned. Not only do we have a situation where there's lives, but now we have a situation to where you are going to be beholden to these endeavors, or these excursions, as President Trump likes to say. These excursions, even though I'm sure he meant incursion, but we are essentially left with the bill for this, right? And that was another thing that Cato was very, very concerned about, was the fact of, now you have the blood, here it comes the treasure, all on behalf of things that do not serve the United States, her defense, or the security of our nation. And he goes on to continue, okay, there really was no escape, and he warned that once the deals were made, essentially, right, once you have these deals that are made, they became permanent, right? So it became part of the law of the land. And the obligations from foreign debts and to foreign wars, he goes on to say, will become supreme law of the land, and you are bound by it. You are bound by it. And he saw this type of power, this type of authority, growing into this monstrous being to where, look, they're making it essentially to where you have no representation in this matter. And furthermore, there's nothing that you can do about it. There's not a darn thing that you would be able to do about it because the treaties are treated as the supreme law of the land. He was very worried about this. And say it's something that proved to be disastrous or a wicked mistake. Is there any form of responsibility whatsoever? Not really. And he goes on to say, who is there to punish? The executive can always cover himself with the plea that he was advised by the Senate, and the Senate, being a collective body, are not easily made accountable for maladministration. So he saw this situation to where you have the executive that essentially can shield itself from saying, well, I did not make this decision based off of like accurate information. I was misinformed. I was not told the truth, or whatever the case is, whatever the convenient excuse is. He can turn around and he can blame the Senate, but then it becomes very muddied when you look at the Senate, because who then in the Senate is it that you would be able to adequately point the finger at as it pertains to maladministration? And essentially the way that he saw it is really it was a disastrous cocktail for tyranny. So you have the elites, you have the appointments, you have the treaties essentially that you're beholden to. And now he wants to go on and say the Senate is how one could describe it as an unaccountable judiciary. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, he was talking about impeachment. He was talking about the realm of impeachment and the inherent conflict of interest. So as they go into describe, Article 1, Section 3 gives the Senate the sole power to try all impeachments, okay? Including officials the Senate itself had confirmed by serving both as judge and jury. Cato predicted senators would protect their political allies rather than hold them accountable, okay? And he goes on to say, the propriety of the advice they gave him as senators. So in presidential impeachment, senators would be judging the propriety of the advice they gave him as senators, right? And furthermore, when you go ahead, can the Senate in this therefore be impartial adjudicator? Okay. And will they not rather serve as the screen to great public defaulters? So his general concern here, which I think is something that we can see today, all of these different things in some capacity we have seen today, but their worry was like, hey, look, like you're going to appoint the people who, obviously have a very, very close tie with the executive. They appoint the people for the executive. They help oversee treaties, so if there's any wrongdoing, if they're close and they have this political elite class, these are the people you're expected to try the guilty party. Well, what if it's the guilty party within the Senate? What if it's the guilty party for the president that they tend to like? What if it's over something that they overwhelmingly approve of? And his argument essentially is really this, which is they are not going to hold these people accountable. They're going to shield them from any real ramifications, especially from something like impeachment. And he goes on to describe the Senate and the executive essentially as a dangerous union where they're improperly connected, okay? And another portion of a quote is he says, it's as unnecessary as it is dangerous. And he was talking about the vice presidency here, targeting essentially, as they go on to describe, the VP's role as president of the Senate as a prime example of a dangerous blending of the executive and legislative powers, as Cato goes forth to describe. So you have a situation to where now you have the executive that is extending its reach down into the Senate. He was very concerned about this. He felt it should not be a thing because there would be undue influence and likely this unreasonable connection here that would create more problems than it would solve, right? So essentially, Cato also goes forward to look at Montesquieu. And we did talk about Montesquieu a little bit previously. When essentially you have the same group that makes law both enforces the law, as they go on to say in the book, you essentially get tyranny, something that we've seen many people talk about over the course of time. It would be the political equivalent of letting the fox guard the henhouse, something we've also heard very, very much. And so he goes on to say, Cato goes on to say, and I quote, apprehensions may arise lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. So he's talking about this idea of, okay, well, you have the Senate that's for the most part relatively unchecked. They have their political elite. Okay, I'm going back through this. They have their political elite, right? Then they have the appointments, then they have the treaties, then they have the ability to oversee impeachments. And now you're seeing this extend all the way down into not only the legislating and the enacting of a law, but also they have the ability now to be able to execute the law. And this was something that they felt very, very, he felt extremely apprehensive about this. He's like, whoa, there's way too many red flags here. The Senate is given way too much authority, way too much control, and this is going to be a drastic problem. And he goes on to say, where the power of judging joined with the legislative, the life and the liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control. For the judge would then be the legislator where it joined to the executive power. The judge might balance or behave with all of the violence of an oppressor. He was very concerned about the blending of the roles here. And he was even more concerned about the fact of essentially what he's describing is, look, there's nothing restraining the Senate whatsoever. They have the ability to oversee some of the most critical things in the proposed Constitution. And furthermore, you have the House of Representatives that has a far more diminished role and really no real direct representation for the people. You would have an indirect representation at the best case scenario for the people, and furthermore of the states. And this created a serious, serious issue. He then goes on to explain with all the branches, essentially with all the branches that are blended like this, the idea of checks and balances is basically not there. And he goes on to explain they would essentially act in concert. So when you look at everything that we've talked about so far and everything that's been described by Cato and very eloquently by Michael Bolton and Mike Meharry in this book, you see the picture that's being painted here. You see the real red flags, the real warnings, the real concerns that he had about the way that the current proposed Constitution was set up, which is the fact that there's really no checks and balances, and the potential for blending the branches would give way to an oligarchy and a tyranny, and perhaps something more ruinous in form as time drags on, with more power ascending to the Senate and likely the executive, and taking it away from the representatives of the people, the states, and the people themselves. He does go on to say, their dependence on each other will prevent either from being a check upon the other. So essentially removing any real system. There is no stops. There's no gaps. When you get the people you like in there, it turns out to be ever favoring towards whatever agenda you might have or any ambitions that you might have. It becomes a self-serving system to be able to bring, treasure and power and all of these other influences to the people within the Senate, and furthermore to enrich the Senate and the executive at the same time. Essentially, they go on to explain that Cato warned that when a system has no built-in limits, the rule of law gives way to the rule of men. And furthermore, Cato specifically goes on to say, whether the power and influence of the one or the other is to prevail, will depend on the character and the abilities of the men who hold the offices at the time, right? So he's like, look, This is all entirely dependent on the people that are within those offices. They are entirely dependent, essentially, to elaborate on how manipulable they are, how corruptible they are, how you would be able to influence these people, which he does go on to explain about foreign influence. And we did talk a little bit about that before in a previous episode. But the reality of it is like really the cards in the deck are stacked against the House of Representatives, the states, and the people with the current way that the Constitution was being set up. And so he really described it as a unstoppable engine. And Cato goes on to say this: when the Senate, so important a branch of the legislature, is so far removed from the people as to have little or no connection with them, and when their duration in office is such as to have resemblance to perpetuity, when they are connected with the executive by the appointment of all officers, and also become a judiciary for the trial of officers of their own appointments, added to all this, when none but men of opulence will hold the seat, what is there left to resist and repel this host of influence and power? Yeah, I think he paints a pretty precise message there as to what his concerns were. And going over this one more time, he talked about the entrenched elites. The 6-year terms with no direct accountability to the people would guarantee the rise of permanent political class. Cronyism, control over appointments, would be a tool to build a network of influence, ensuring only the political allies held power. He then continues in the things that we just went over: the unchecked foreign policy, where power over treaties would allow them to entangle a nation in foreign wars and debts. Sham accountability, the idea that there's really no accountability, there's a bleeding of powers together. The power to try all impeachments mean that they would sit as judge and jury for their own political allies, essentially insulating these people from any ramifications. And then the collapsed checks and balances. A close connection to the executive would destroy any meaningful separation of powers, creating a ruling partnership instead of competing branches. And essentially, they go and they summarize that the Senate was the eternal gear in a machine designed to grind down the Republican government, creating a ruling class that would govern only for itself. The Senate wasn't merely flawed, it was a fundamental threat to the very idea of a free government. And when I look at this and I look at his concerns about the Senate, I think we see a lot of these issues playing out today. We see these playing out before our very eyes on a variety of issues, notwithstanding things like treaties, wars, funding, the protectionism that comes with things like impeachments, the idea that they're insulating their own people. And, it creates an extremely trepidatious pathway, as Cato had mentioned, for tyranny to grow and for the expansion of government to occur, with the people, as a great quote by George Carlin, essentially they create a big club and you're not in it. And when you have that big club that you're not in, it becomes more about serving themselves and enriching themselves versus serving the people and helping the people become prosperous, which in turn would help create a more prosperous nation. Now, when we look at the Anti-Federalists, they had many, many concerns, and this is just one area of those concerns about the final product of the Constitution. They argued that it did not have enough safeguards. It was not defined well enough. It was something that gave way to far more expansive and overreaching power, far more undefined authority. It left the door open for increasingly oppressive, tyrannical, and oligarchical type of situations that would have, as they saw it, would invariably arise. But one thing that I find is very interesting, that was a theme amongst at least all of the ones in this particular book, but I think if you go back and you study others, it was the general idea that the Constitution essentially posed the threat that it would take a government from being a federal system, a federal republic, to a national government, which would open the door to undue influence, undue corruption, and ultimately a long train of abuses, something of which they had just experienced that they had come from, and something that would be easily corruptible and tyrannical as time went on. And I think it's one of those things that the more and more you read what it is that they have to say, you tend to see these things come a little bit more to fruition. Now, realistically, if it hadn't been for some of the objections, namely ones about the fact that there was no Bill of Rights in the final Constitution or the final product of the Constitution before they fully finished everything, we may have never even had a Bill of Rights in our Constitution. Many of them rallied around the idea that there needs to be an essential Bill of Rights in the Constitution, that it cannot wait. And you had individuals that argued, Hamilton being one of them, that, oh, we can put the Bill of Rights in the Constitution after it's fully ratified. And he said that the people would, eventually come around to asking for it or demanding for it. And they didn't trust that enough. They felt that there had to be an absolute inclusion of this, as well as many other things that would ultimately restrain the power given to the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and making sure that ultimately they were separated and they acted upon all of the functions of government in their own separate ways and not blending these types of things together. One of the other things that I really want to emphasize before I wrap up here tonight is the fact that when you look also at one of the issues that some of the federal or anti-federalists had was when the conventions initially had started, people were brought together on the premise that it was to amend the Articles of Confederation. That was something that they were told. But instead, what they ended up getting was not amendments made to the Articles of Confederation. It ended up being an entire redrafting of a constitution that ultimately became what we have today. So many people felt somewhat betrayed by this. They felt like they were goaded into a situation that was never the goal to begin with. And furthermore, they saw this as a real problem, because if you're not going to be honest about the means or reasoning as to why you're bringing people together in the first place, how can we expect you to be honest about the things that you're going to put in the Constitution? It was one of the points that I think many anti-federalists had. It was something that they were very contentious about, and they felt that it was, it was something that ultimately was aimed at usurping the sovereignty of the states and of the people that resided in the states. And I think when you look at that, it's kind of hard to disagree with that. You come together to try and improve something only to find that the reason you're actually there is to create something entirely new. And I do want to add also, in ending, that many of the documentations by people like Mason, Elbridge Gerry, Luther Martin, I believe Cato makes reference to it as well. You also have the Pennsylvania dissenters that remark on this as well. But the Federalists, some of the Federalists that were at these conventions, made it a point to not record the minutes as it pertained to the anti-federalists. So when I sit here and I think about that, as I'm going through this and I'm reading the arguments, I'm looking at a variety of different things that took place, to them, it was very suspect, and it was quite a slight against their fellow attendees at the convention. And to me, that right there is a red flag that, oh, you're not willing to write down or notate our arguments in some circumstances. And when I see that they were unwilling to do that, that to me just screamed usurpation. That meant that there was already a mindset that they were already shifting away. A nation that had just come from a circumstance where liberty was very much under the boot and the heel, and rights were being trampled on, to you had a disposition to where they were willing, some were willing to go back to that and consolidate a more powerful and central government that ultimately, as many of the anti-federalists had stated, feared would create an oligarchy, a tyranny. Some had even mentioned a monarchy, etc. And when you start that and you try to omit the arguments of the other side, not in good faith, but in the ability of completely disregarding them, I hate to say it, there was some wokeism there to where they just didn't want to hear what had to be said. You know, if you're not agreeing with me, we don't really care to hear what you have to say. It did exist back then too. And so you have a situation to where, in my mind, even looking at it back then, it's very, very, it's very worrisome to see that that was a mentality that they had to fight against. And so when they talk about, when you have some of the founders that talk about an eternal vigilance, I do believe that eternal vigilance is what is required to maintain liberty and rights in a just form of governance in a society. Without it, you will get usurpitous individuals that will disregard everything you have to say, and you will eventually get the ruinous result of the blending of these branches, as the anti-federalists had suggested. And in my mind, at least, what we see today as it pertains to war, to taxation, to legislation, to impeachments, to essentially covering for the executive or others within the Senate and their appointees. And ultimately, you get a protectionist state for the government itself, and not so much for the benefit of the people, something that becomes destructive, oppressive, and tyrannical. So I hope all of you that came in to check out the episode tonight, I hope you found it informative. I hope you found it somewhat interesting. It's really something I've started to dig into a lot more. I've always been a little bit more of the anti-federalist tilt myself, but it is amazing. The more and more you dig into it, the more and more you read, and you start to kind of see what really occurred back then and a lot of the similarities that we're seeing today, or even some of the warnings that have come to fruition in a very full form today. So with that being said, thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you for watching the episode tonight, coming by and supporting the show. As always, if you like what you see here, if you like the information, if you like the show, and you think that it's worth sharing, hit a like, share it, subscribe. Every little bit helps in the algorithm. I would even say, please, if you're willing to, throw a comment down below. I try to do my best to answer the comments outside of the lives when it makes sense. But also, I try to answer as much as I can here in the lives as well. Every little bit helps substantially, and I greatly, greatly appreciate every person who comes in, provides their input, provides their opinion, their perception, their disposition. So without you guys, I really can't do it. And right now, just to put out there, YouTube is going through another change that's going to make it infinitely harder for creators. It really is going to stifle the creation of certain videos. They're coming at it against from a tilt of AI in terms of patterns that some YouTubers will invariably create with a lot of their content. There's a consistency issue that they really will hit videos on. So if you have any form of consistency, if you have any type of consistent video as it pertains to like what I do, they may go after that. So it's not just myself, but it's other YouTubers. If there's people that you like, right now is to get behind the people that you feel are worth supporting and really help them out, because that is going to send, hopefully it will help bolster and send a message to YouTube to where you can continue to have platforms like this and to be able to see people that you like. So to me, we really have to fight back against stuff like this, and we really have to work together to make sure that people can maintain their ability to get the messages out that they want, whether it is historical, whether it is political, or whether you like watching a gaming channel. We all have to kind of work together on this. So I'm going to go through just a few of the comments here, and then I will hit you guys and gals with a little bit of outro music. So looks like some people did get the ground or the sound issue. Thank you, Chuck, Gene, let's see, Ground Fog, David, Cheddar Cheese. Thank you guys for coming out and supporting the show this evening. Let's see, that is a George Carlin phrase. It is one big club, and you are not a part of it. That's right, David. And it's still one of the more timeless ones that we see today. It's why I love to use it, because I do think it very much explains a very precise situation that we are in currently. So, Gene Woo 13, or as I like to call him, Gene the Machine. So many wise words that have been twisted by the lizard people for their own gains. Thank you, brother. I have to pop this up here. Thank you, Gene, for coming out and supporting the show, and thank you for the comment. Yeah, there is no end really to a lot of the twisting of words, and I think also when you look at history in general, it's why I always incentivize and tell people, go do a little research, go pick up a book. You might be surprised at some of the stuff that you find enjoyable, and especially if it's pertaining to situations or things that you have an interest in, there's always a lot to learn. So I have to highlight this one as well. Boo, Hamilton. Yeah, Hamilton's not a favorite of a lot of people. It's weird because Hamilton very much was one of those founding fathers that really was that broken clock is right twice a day type of guy. There were a handful of things that he was decent on, but it wasn't much. And whenever he did kind of support the individual, anything to do with liberty and rights whatsoever, it was kind of an anomaly, so to speak. But and Hamilton was a guy who really wanted to have a central style bank very, very early on in the creation of the Constitution and the country. And man, they really, to the credit, even Federalists to some degree rallied against that idea. But there were a number of Federalists who really did like that idea. And thankfully, it didn't start much earlier than it already did. And then I just want to do this one. Another great show, David says. Thank you so much, David. And thank you once again, each and every one of you, for coming out, supporting the show, watching the episode, and hearing what I have to say. Without further ado, I will hit you guys and gals with some outro music. Stay tuned for next Thursday. I should have a show lined up for you at about I haven't figured it out yet. I'll make a post on YouTube so you guys and gals can see it. It's either going to be 17 or 1800. I will let you all know. But Saturdays are always going to be that 1700 mark unless something crazy changes. So take care. God bless. And I hope you all have a fantastic rest of your evening and a great weekend.